I wasn't a supporter of the way it was done the first time around. I was on the losing side of a lot of bureaucratic battles, and I'm not important enough to be on any side, but my point of view was on the losing side of important bureaucratic battles in 2002 and 2003. I think a big part of what went wrong in Iraq was the original conception was that the United States would race into Iraq, overthrow Saddam Hussein, install a provisional government made up of Iraqis, and get out as rapidly as possible. We then had a terrible internal argument inside the United States government where the people who were envisioned as that provisional government were vetoed. Now, maybe that was a good decision, maybe it was a bad decision, but it meant that we raced into Iraq with no idea, with no plan for what was to come next. And because there never was an alternative to the provisional government idea. Let me start all this again because it's too complicated as I explain.
Yeah, it is.
Let me start it again. During the debate over the Iraq War, to simplify a little, there are two competing ideas in the United States government about how to do Iraq. One idea broadly associated with Donald Rumsfeld was, this is not a war, it's a raid. What we're going to do is we're going to get as few, 70,000 troops, race them up the Tigris and Euphrates, capture or kill Saddam Hussein, install a provisional government, and then get out and wish them well. The other view, which coalesced around Colin Powell, was that first view is completely irresponsible. It can never work that way. What we need to do is we need to accept that if we go into Iraq, the provisional people are no good. They are tainted in all kinds of ways. We are going to have to do a long, slow process of developing Iraqi institutions. That'll take 5 years, maybe 10, and that means we're going to need a massive occupying army, which means 70,000 won't do it. We need 350,000, and we need to stay a decade. Now, these are two starkly different visions of how to proceed. And who knows which one was the right one. We ended up melding them together in an especially disastrous way, which was we did Donald Rumsfeld's war and Colin Powell's peace. We said we're sending 70,000 people racing up, I think it was in the end 130, racing up the Tigris and the Euphrates, and then we are not installing provisional government, then we are going to do an occupation that is going to last 5 or 10 years where we try to build all sorts of Iraqi institutions. Now, obviously, that was a formula for failure. And it was a formula for failure because we put together two parts that absolutely predictably could not work. And when I look back on the way that decision-making was done, I mean, the great tragedy was that there should have been a moment, and there are institutions in the government to force this kind of work, where somebody said, Mr. President, the war plan and the peace plan do not add up together. They won't work. So you're going to have to either have a peace plan that follows your war plan, or a war plan that is consistent with your peace plan, or you have to forget the whole thing. So here's what we end up doing. We send 130,000 troops racing upriver. We do seize Baghdad, and then we stop, and we ask each other, what happens now? And there's a week of uncertainty, and at the end of the week, the president calls Paul Bremer and says, I'd like you to be my pro-consul in Baghdad. Now, Bremer is a highly dedicated public servant, a very intelligent man with a distinguished record. He doesn't speak Arabic. He's not a Middle East specialist. And anyway, it wouldn't matter if he were. He's not an Iraqi. He is obviously a foreigner. And when you install him in that kind of off-the-cuff way, you are simply asking for trouble. This was a decision. The decision to install Bremer was the product of a failure to make a decision a year earlier about what the government of liberated Iraq was going to look like. And we began our conversation by talking about the malperformance of the U.S. government. And this is just one of the most extreme instances. I mean, the idea that you would go to war without having had an agreement inside your government about what you were going to do after the war. And I'll say here, because I was a very unimportant but well-placed observer of these events, what I believed would happen is I could have had this same conversation with you in 2002, and I would have said, these are the things that are happening, I'm really worried about it. But what I would then have said, and this is where I was really wrong, since it will obviously be a catastrophe if we arrive in Baghdad without a clear plan for what comes next, therefore it follows that there must be, it is certain, there has to be a solution that is going to be agreed upon. I hope the president will choose the one that my faction favors. But maybe we'll be overruled and he'll choose the one that the other faction favors. But he will certainly have to make a choice because there's no way that we're going to go to war to overthrow a regime without a clear idea for what happens on overthrow day plus 10. But that is what happened. I wouldn't say unable, but he failed to make the decision, and then historians will then, I think, spend the next 30 years arguing about why that decision was not made. But it was not made. I was sympathetic to the defense point of view. Well, I didn't choose him. Now, look, here's the case for Chalabi, which is if we're already getting rid of Saddam, we want to replace Saddam not with an American proconsul, but with an Iraqi provisional government. Well, where would we find such a thing? Well, as it happens, there's this group of exile Iraqis who have themselves formed an organization. And it was a pretty big group of people canvassing a pretty wide range of points of view, from religious people to Iraqi communists to Shiites and Sunnis together. And we're talking about many hundreds of people. And they had formed an organization, and they had agreed that Chalabi was going to be the man in charge of it. So he wasn't an American choice. He was the choice who had sort of come up through the system of exile politics. Now, what the State Department people would argue against him was, one, exile politics aren't going to work. That's a big mistake. We shouldn't rely on exiles. We have to rely on indigenous people. Problem, there are no indigenous people, or because they're all, the brave ones are dead, and the others are compromised. And anyway, it's going to be hard to find them. But that was the case for Chalabi. He was not an American choice. It was rather, he was the man who happened to be leading the closest thing to a provisional government that there was to find. But I had no brief for Chalabi personally. And in fact, this was part of the crossfire that happened. That there were different bureaucratic camps that each had their own favorite Iraqi. So it was certainly true that the vice president and the civilians in the Defense Department preferred Chalabi. And the people at the State Department preferred a man named Adnan Pachachi, who'd had important roles in the pre-Saddam government. And then the CIA and the British tended to prefer a man named Iyad Alawi, who would later go on to be Prime Minister of Iraq. And I have to say, even at the time, and certainly now, it almost didn't matter which one of those guys you picked. Pick one. But don't pick Paul Bremer. Any one of them would have been a better choice than Paul Bremer, because this is a society that not only was brutalized and oppressed, it was also deeply humiliated. And they needed to feel, and this is a mistake we very nearly made in World War II. When President Roosevelt got on so badly with Charles de Gaulle, he never appreciated how important it was that the French felt that they had liberated themselves. And the failure to give de Gaulle enough of a role to make it feel like the French had liberated themselves, whether that was right or not, was a big irritant in American-French relations and continues to this day. It's very important not to do favors for people. They don't forgive you for doing favors for them. Whereas if you can say, we helped you, do a favor for yourself. You liberated yourself, we provided the instrumentalities, but you are the heroes. You deserve the credit. You owe us nothing. We're just glad, that our interests overlapped. You have a much healthier relationship going forward. And that was the path we did not take.